He entered the luxury restaurant with only one goal, to humiliate his ex. But as soon as he saw her, standing in the heart of the room, he froze. Myra, now the CEO's cherished wife, had transformed into a vision of grace, and the restaurant fell silent at her presence. "Welcome, my beautiful loyal family," I said, my voice warm. "I'm your storyteller, James, and I want to begin by sending my deepest prayers to you all. May peace, love, and blessings fill your hearts and guide you through each day. Today I've prepared something special, an unforgettable story that I believe will touch your soul. I invite you to stay with me until the end, because this one will resonate deeply. And don't forget to share where you're listening from in the comments below. I love hearing from each of you. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of our journey together. Now, let's dive in. The moment Myra stepped into Lorraine, the air seemed to shift. The hum of the elite crowd fell into stunned silence, forks pausing midair, wine glasses halted, and all eyes locked on her. She walked through the golden-lit opulence of the restaurant, her red dress a bold, living flame in a room full of muted luxury. Her gown, the deep crimson of ripened pomegranates, clung to her every curve like silk under the touch of a lover's hand. The slit along her thigh left just enough to captivate without revealing too much, and the soft sound of the fabric brushing her skin was almost scandalous in this world of power and wealth. Her brown skin glistened in the chandeliers, kissed by the sun of a private island in the Mediterranean where Jorge had taken her just weeks ago. Each step she took was deliberate, confident, with the sharp click of her stilettos against the marble floor adding rhythm to her every movement. She had walked into this very restaurant years ago, invisible, just a server trembling as she carried plates worth more than her rent. Now as she walked past the staff, they stood at attention, heads bowed in unison. Jorge's presence was a storm in a tailored black suit. His grip on her hand was tender, not possessive, but reverent, as if he still couldn't believe she was his. His silver-streaked hair caught the light, a sign of the years he had spent building his empire. He looked around, scanning the room, not for threats, but for her comfort. "You're shaking," he murmured, his thumb tracing small circles on her knuckles, his voice a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through her ribs. "I'm not scared," she said, her chin lifting slightly. The bitter memories of her past hung on her, like the taste of old coffee. The maitre d', once a man who'd sneered at her for dropping a plate, approached with a bow so deep that his nose nearly brushed his knees. "Your usual table, Mrs. Willie." The title still sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Willie, a name that had once felt like a shackle. But not anymore. She was not the woman she had been. Then the doors burst open, and the sharp, mocking sound of laughter sliced through the room like ice cracking underfoot. Myra didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Her body knew before her mind did, her pulse quickening, her fingers tightening around Jorge's. Damian Carter stood in the doorway, a rumpled Armani suit and a disheveled tie. His once perfect blonde hair was now a mess, and his blue eyes scanned the room with the arrogance of a man who thought the world owed him something. When his gaze finally landed on Myra, the glass in his hand slipped, crashing to the floor. Champagne fizzed over the marble like a dying gasp. Damian's lips parted as his face drained of color. The last time he had seen her, she had been scrubbing their crumbling apartment floor after one of his tantrums, her hands raw, her spirit broken. Now she was a queen in red, and he was just another man in a room full of people who had forgotten his name. Jorge's grip on her waist tightened as he whispered in her ear, "Look at him, Reina Mia. Look at what he's become." Myra did. Damian's jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. His companion, a blonde half his age, clung to his sleeve. But Damian shook her off, his eyes fixed on Myra with something cold in them. A smirk twisted Damian's lips as he straightened his tie and walked toward them. Myra exhaled. The game was on. The tension in the air thickened as Damian approached. Every footstep echoed, the sound of polished shoes against marble sharp and ominous. The silverware in the room had stilled. The music faded to background noise as everyone's eyes turned to watch. "Well, well," Damian said, his voice dripping with false charm. "If it isn't Myra Carter?" He emphasized her old name, the one she had worn like a chain. Or should I say Mrs. Willie? His tone was light, but the venom beneath it was unmistakable. Myra's fingers tightened around Jorge's arm, but her face remained unreadable. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of flinching. Not again. Not ever again. Damien moved closer, his breath hot with the scent of bourbon. Tell me, Myra, he stage whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Did you research Jorge's net worth before you spilled wine on his shirt? Or was it his brother you targeted first? The lie hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. The whispering began. Jorge's expression didn't change as he turned to face Damien, his voice low but clear. You're mistaken, he said. My wife has never needed to chase anything in her life. He picked up a napkin and, with a tenderness that felt like a weapon, dabbed at the champagne on Myra's dress. Then with a simple flick of his wrist, a sleek black dossier landed on the table between them. The logo on the cover was unmistakable, the same law firm that had publicly disowned Damien's family after his latest scandal. Damien's face went white, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. The whispers around the room grew louder. Jorge leaned in close, his lips brushing Damien's ear in a mockery of intimacy. Leave now, he whispered, so softly it was almost a caress. Or I'll have you removed in a way you'll never live down. The threat wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Damien staggered back, his face contorted with fury and shame. The guests turned away, already erasing him from their world. Jorge led Myra to their private table, his hand at the small of her back, steadying her. But as she walked, Myra felt her heart pounding. Not from fear, but from the realization that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The champagne droplet on Myra's décolletage caught the light like a liquid diamond as Jorge's arm slid around her waist. His fingers splayed possessively across the curve of her hip, a silent claim that spoke louder than any words in the suddenly still restaurant. The staff bowed in perfect unison as Myra passed, their heads lowered in respect. Behind them, Damien stood, his starched collar digging into his jowls, his voice trembling as he called out, Mrs. Willie? The staff's synchronized bow sent a ripple of white jackets and black vests through the room. At table 7, socialite Margot de Leon choked on her caviar, and Charles Way, a finance magnate, discreetly snapped a photo, his eyes darting between Myra's serene smile and Damien's ashen face. To speak, his voice low and cold, each word laced with an unspoken promise of destruction. You think you have any control left? That any of this? He gestured vaguely at the ruins of Damien's dignity, at the stain left on his reputation. Can be fixed with your pitiful little threats? You've done your damage, but you've forgotten one thing, Damien. His eyes narrowed, a predatory gleam flickering within them. Damien swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as they reached for the edge of the chair, gripping it for some semblance of stability. But Jorge's gaze never wavered. You're nothing without her, Jorge continued, each syllable drawing closer to the core of Damien's deepest insecurities. And the world has seen it. You're no longer a man who matters. You're just another footnote in a story that doesn't belong to you. Damien's mouth went dry, and his stomach twisted into knots as the weight of Jorge's words began to sink in. His entire existence, once so secure, so full of power and influence, was unraveling in front of him, piece by piece, at the hands of the woman he had once tried to break, and now she was untouchable. Jorge leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his fingers tracing the rim as if savoring the moment. You made her cry, he repeated, the finality in his voice making the room feel even colder, if that was even possible. Damien's face drained of color, his heart hammering in his chest as the realization struck him with a brutal force. He had pushed her too far, and now it was too late. Myra, Reina, had risen, and she was untouchable. The world had changed, and he had been left behind in the wake of his own arrogance and cruelty. You'll never see her again, Jorge added, his words a quiet promise of the future that awaited Damien, one filled with regret, failure, and the harsh consequences of his actions. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, a final reminder that the game had ended and Damien had lost. With a flick of his wrist, Jorge dismissed him, and Damien's legs, now shaky and weak, carried him to the door. He had been a king in his own mind. but now he was nothing more than a pawn in a game he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his bones, and the last vestiges of his empire crumbled in his wake. Jorge sat back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he lifted his glass to his lips. Myra, or rather, Reina now, had finally taken her place. And no one, least of all Damien, could ever take it from her again. World had crumbled completely. Every call he made, every email he sent, every attempt to salvage his name or his assets only sank him further into the mire of his own making. The weight of his reputation, built on years of manipulation and control, had evaporated in the blink of an eye. He'd never imagined a fall from grace could be so swift, so complete. As the day wore on, the news continued to spread. By noon, Damien's lawyers had sent him a grim message. The board has voted to remove you from the company. The loss of his position, the money, the influence, it all felt distant now. The real devastation was the complete unraveling of his identity. He wasn't just losing his wealth, he was losing the very thing that had defined him. The idea that he was someone important, someone people feared and admired, was now nothing more than a joke. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his sister. "I hope you've learned your lesson, Damien. I never want to see you again." Her words, cold and final, were a dagger to what remained of his pride. He'd made so many enemies in his life, but never imagined his own family would be among them. His mind was spinning, grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. But all the tools he'd relied on, money, power, control, were now weapons turned against him. And for the first time, he understood the depth of his loneliness. There was no one left to defend him, no one left to believe in him. By the time evening fell, the damage was irreversible. His once grand penthouse, with its sprawling views of the city skyline, felt like a prison. He stared at the empty space around him, his reflection in the glass windows looking like a stranger, a man he no longer recognized. Damien had thought his life would always be one of luxury and dominance, but now all he had left were the ghosts of his past mistakes, haunting him from every corner of his shattered existence. The distant sound of his phone vibrating on the table was the only reminder of how far he had fallen and how irrevocably the world had changed. The stocks had crashed, investors fled with terse, one-line emails offering no explanations. None were needed. Business partners scrambled to issue performative press releases dripping with faux disbelief. We had no idea of his true character. His once loyal assistant resigned via text. "HR has my keycard." When Damien finally dared to check his bank account, his hands trembled so violently he mistyped his password 3 times. The balance that stared back at him was a mere shadow of yesterday's wealth. Jorge had orchestrated this downfall with surgical precision. Every line of credit frozen. Every pending deal vanished. Even his elite club memberships were revoked without warning. The concierge at the Vanguard, where he dined weekly for a decade, hung up on him mid-sentence. But the final humiliation came when his doorman, always so eager to please, handed him a printed notice from the condo board. "You might be more comfortable elsewhere." The message was clear. "You're toxic now. No one wants you here." By noon, the memes began. Damien's face photoshopped onto a beggar's body outside Lorraine. His once slick voice dubbed over with squeaky toy sounds. Side-by-side comparisons of before, smug, suited, and after, disheveled, desperate. Captioned, "When you harass the wrong queen." Damien's downfall trended worldwide. Celebrities he'd once partied with made jokes at his expense. Michelin-starred chefs posted tributes to Myra's grace. Even his favorite tailor, the one who'd made his first bespoke suit, issued a statement saying Damien's remaining store credit would be donated to a women's shelter. The ultimate betrayal came not from the media, not even from Jorge. It came from his father, the man who'd ignored every call since the scandal broke. The law firm released a press statement. "The Carter family will be donating Damien Carter's trust fund to organizations supporting victims of emotional abuse." The wording was brutal, crafted by someone who knew exactly where to cut. As the sun set on the worst day of his life, Damien sat alone in his soon-to-be repossessed penthouse. The city lights twinkled below like 1,000 mocking eyes. On his laptop, the video still played, his voice sneering. You'll always be nothing. The woman he'd tried to diminish had become everything. And for the first time in his entitled, insulated life, Damien Carter understood what it meant to be powerless. The morning sun streamed through Lorraine's towering windows, striping the marble floor in golden light. Mira stood tall in crimson Louboutins, her reflection gleaming like a goddess resurrected. The staff rose to greet her. Good morning, Mrs. Well, their voices reverent, as if speaking to royalty. The sous chef, a burly man who once scoffed at her ideas, now bowed slightly as he presented the menu with trembling hands. The hostess, once dismissive, rushed to adjust Myra's chair before she even reached the table. The scent of Colombian coffee and warm croissants wrapped around her like a fragrant crown. At the grand piano, Jorge played a gentle melody, his eyes lifting to meet hers with a warmth reserved only for her. She crossed the floor with unhurried grace, brushing a speck of dust from his shoulder, her diamond catching the light. This restaurant, once her prison, was now her kingdom. She turned to face the room. Her voice, calm and clear, cut through the reverent silence. Starting this Sunday, Lorraine will open its doors to women who need a safe place to heal. We'll provide meals, resources, and most importantly, dignity. The silence held for a heartbeat. Then Jorge stood beside her, hands on her shoulders, lips brushing her temple. His voice rang out with quiet power. What my wife says, goes. Applause erupted. The pastry chef, herself a survivor, wiped tears from her flour-dusted cheeks. The sommelier began planning non-alcoholic pairings. The security team discussed discreet protocols. The restaurant transformed before Myra's eyes, from an exclusive haven for the elite into a sanctuary of hope. She moved through the preparations with quiet determination, memories of her own trauma fueling every decision. This wasn't about revenge. This was about redemption. This was about turning pain into purpose. Later in the wine cellar, their secret sanctuary, Jorge cupped her face, his forehead resting against hers. You amaze me, he whispered, and with those words the last broken shard of her old self melted away. By Sunday the doors opened. Women arrived, some tentative, others defiant, all of them carrying silent wounds. The dining room, once a stage for pomp, now pulsed with empathy. No pretension, just comfort, nourishment, safety. Myra moved from table to table, not as a benefactor, but as a sister who understood. She squeezed trembling hands. She listened. She shared. Across the room, Jorge, her billionaire, served drinks with a bartender's ease, pride radiating from him like sunlight. That night, long after the last guest had left with a warm meal and a list of resources, Myra stood alone in the center of the restaurant. The air still hummed with echoes of laughter and whispered confessions. She ran her fingers along the bar where she'd once worked in silence, head down. This was her legacy. Not the clothes, not the headlines, not even Jorge's devotion. Her legacy was power born of survival. The Mediterranean moon hung low over the dark sea, casting silver light across the waves that lapped gently against the hull of the Elysium. Jorge's 180-foot yacht, now aglow with fairy lights. The scent of jasmine and salt danced in the air. Myra stood barefoot at the railing, her silk dress rippling in the breeze, champagne forgotten in her hand. She remembered the morning, Jorge blindfolding her, whispering, "Trust me," the helicopter ride, the secluded bay, the ghostly silhouette of the yacht waiting, the petals on their bed, her favorite book beside gardenias, every detail. Her. Now, as the yacht glided towards some secret destination, she turned to find Jorge behind her, barefoot, shirt undone, hair tousled by sea air. His eyes drank her in, full of that look that always undid her, the look that said, "I would choose you in every lifetime." He took her hand and led her to a single table at the bow, dressed in their wedding china. The future shimmered before her, limitless. Their first meal as husband and wife was nothing short of a fairy tale. As Jorge pulled out her chair with exaggerated gallantry, the crew seemed to materialize by magic. A sommelier presenting a bottle of 1990 Dom Perignon with the reverence one might reserve for a holy relic. and the chef himself unveiling dishes that told the story of their love and flavor. There was the truffle risotto they had shared on their third date, the passion fruit mousse from their honeymoon in Bora Bora, and the tiny lemon tarts she'd burned during their first chaotic attempt at baking, now perfected by a master who understood how precious memories could be, even the scorched ones. Between courses, between sips of champagne that tasted like liquid starlight, Jorge watched her with that quiet intensity that always preceded something grand. His fingers toyed with the velvet box in his pocket, burning a hole in his thoughts all evening. Then at last, when the final plate had been cleared and the crew had vanished like mist, he stood, held out his hand, and smiled with a promise that seemed to stretch across lifetimes. He led her to the yacht's upper deck, where stars sprawled in breathtaking infinity, the Milky Way a shimmering river across a velvet sky. And there, beneath that celestial cathedral, he dropped to one knee, not to propose. That moment had long passed, but to press into her palm a set of keys, cool and heavy, attached to a tiny silver replica of a villa. She looked at him, confused, until he pointed toward the coastline. Nestled against the cliffs was a whitewashed mansion, its terraces spilling with bougainvillea, its windows glowing gold against the night. It took a moment for her to understand. It was hers, the villa she had doodled on napkins during tedious meetings, the one with the infinity pool that melted into the horizon, the library with laddered shelves, the kitchen tiled in cobalt blue, the very image she had once pinned on Pinterest and then forgotten. Her breath caught, her eyes flooded with tears that made the stars blur. And Jorge, her Jorge, who built empires before breakfast but still remembered how she took her coffee, who silenced boardrooms with a glance but melted when she traced his scars, who had rewritten her story simply by loving her, pulled her close and whispered words that shattered her completely. You didn't just survive, you became my everything. And as the yacht speakers began to play their song, that haunting piano piece from the restaurant where they'd first met, they swayed together, bare feet on cool teak, her arms around his neck, his hands resting at her waist. The keys pressed between their hearts. The sea stretched endlessly around them. The stars bore witness to a love that had conquered darkness and now danced freely in the light. Night talk shows called. Invitations poured in, from women's shelters, corporate boards, Ivy League campuses, as the hashtag Jack Myra story surged across continents. Survivors everywhere began sharing their truths, ignited by one woman's fire. Myra, once a name whispered behind closed doors in pity, now stood transformed, not merely a survivor, but a symbol. Not just a woman who had endured, but one who had risen. Her face graced the covers of magazines, not for the wealth of her husband, but for the hard-won wisdom etched in the corners of her eyes. Her inbox brimmed with letters, from daughters, mothers, grandmothers, each seeing in her their own strength reflected back. Through it all, Jorge remained quietly behind her, never in her shadow, but always her anchor, holding her purse backstage at Carnegie Hall, massaging her aching feet after marathon speaking engagements, pressing warm chamomile tea into her trembling hands when memories threatened to overwhelm. His pride never wavered. His love never needed to be spoken aloud to be felt. And when the invitation came from the United Nations, when Mira stood beneath the iconic blue emblem in a cream-colored pantsuit that made her feel both powerful and breakable, when her words echoed across the chamber and were translated into 193 languages, she didn't need to search the crowd for Jorge. She could feel him there, solid and sure, the ground beneath her feet. His love had become the foundation on which she rebuilt her life. The standing ovation felt like thunder. Cameras flashed like stars. And as the world listened, Myra understood. This was it. This unshakable knowing that she was enough. That was the legacy of her pain. A gift she would spend the rest of her life giving away. The grandfather clock in the hallway of their Mediterranean villa chimed 3 times. Its deep notes echoed through the stillness as Jorge sat at his mahogany desk, a single Tiffany lamp casting pools of gold across the parchment beneath his hand. His fountain pen moved in deliberate, fluid strokes, a letter meant for no one but her. On the desk beside him sat a Time magazine, her face staring back at him, radiant and fierce. It rested beneath a paperweight crafted from a shard of the Berlin Wall, his anniversary gift to her. "Because you tear down walls wherever you go," he had said. Around him, the house whispered his devotion. The framed menu from her first pop-up kitchen hung beside a Picasso, the shelf lined with leather-bound journals, each one a speech she'd given, transcribed in his careful hand. "Because your words deserve permanence." The scent of vanilla and almonds still lingered from the midnight cake he'd baked when she came home too wired to sleep. The flour dusted on the marble counters spoke of a man who'd abandoned perfection to offer something warm, something hers. The west wing of the villa now housed the offices of the Mira Willie Foundation, its glass etched with the words she'd spoken during their vow renewal. "We rise by lifting others." It was Jorge's promise made concrete, to build something that would outlive them both. Upstairs, sheer curtains danced on a salt-kissed breeze as Myra stirred in her sleep, one hand reaching instinctively for the space he'd left behind. Her body still remembered his absence, the way it had since their first nights together, when he'd stayed awake just to watch her breathe, tracing each scar Damien had left with a reverence that healed more than time ever could. And as if sensing her from 2 floors below, Jorge set his pen down. The unfinished letter lay open to dry. He moved through the villa with the ease of a man completely at home in his love, pausing only to straighten the framed photo of Myra at the UN, her arms outstretched like she was embracing the world. He took the stairs 2 at a time, bare feet silent on marble, shirt hanging open to reveal his own map of pain, a knife wound from a Rio favela, a burn from a childhood accident, scars that mirrored hers in ways the world would never see. When he reached the bedroom, he found her curled on her side, hands still reaching. His chest tightened with a love so fierce it felt like breaking. And without waking her, he began to move, his body swaying in a slow, silent dance to music only he could hear, arms cradling an invisible partner. Until, "Are you dancing without me?" Her voice was thick with sleep, tinged with laughter. When he turned, she was watching him through heavy-lidded eyes, her hair a wild halo against the pillows, the sheet slipping low to reveal the lacy chemise he'd bought her in Paris. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just held out his hand. When she took it, stepping barefoot onto his feet, her body molding to his, they swayed together, guided only by the rhythm of waves crashing below their cliffs. Jorge buried his face in her hair. Jasmine, salt, home. "Your smile," he whispered against her temple, his hands spanning the space where Damien had once left bruises, "is what I built my empire for." And in that moonlit moment, with silver light lacing the water and the world beyond their gates still clamoring for more of Myra's light, Jorge made a silent vow. That smile would never fade, long after the applause died, long after the foundation flourished in unseen ways. That quiet alchemy of 2 broken souls making something holy from their wounds would be his greatest legacy. The morning of their vow renewal arrived like something blessed. The sun spilled gold over the villa's terraces. The sea mirrored the sky, blue on blue. Orange blossoms perfumed the air, a grove Jorge had planted because she once said she loved the scent. The house hummed with final preparations. Florists adjusted orchids spilling from every archway. Chefs perfected miniature croquembouche towers in lieu of a cake. The string quartet rehearsed a piece composed just for her walk. In the bedroom, Jorge stood alone, hands trembling as he adjusted the cufflinks she had given him. Platinum, engraved with the coordinates of the restaurant where they met and the villa where he'd promised forever. His reflection revealed a man softened by love, his sharp edges worn into something gentler, something whole. Then the door opened, and there she was, backlit by morning light, wearing a gown that stole his breath. The diamond-studded bodice sparkled like stars. The sleeves whispered along the floor. Her skirt was a river of silk. A queen, a goddess. His wife, her hair swept into an elegant chignon. Willie diamonds at her ears and throat. Her makeup subtle, except for that bold red lipstick, the same she wore the night they met, when he saw not a waitress, but a woman who would unravel and rebuild him. She stepped forward, radiant. When she reached up to straighten his already perfect tie, Her fingers lingered. He caught her hand, pressed it to his lips. "You're breathtaking," he whispered. Simple words, heavy with every silent promise. And when the ceremony began, when the people who had loved them through every storm watched her walk down the aisle, on the arm of the sous chef who became her father, Jorge's knees nearly buckled. She walked with the poise of a woman who had earned every inch of her healing. When she reached him, when she placed her hands in his, he dropped to one knee, not to propose, but to offer her the vow he gave every day. "For the rest of my life," he said, voice steady and loud enough for all to hear, "you will never know pain, only love, only laughter, only loyalty." She lifted him, kissed him, and the guests erupted in cheers. The string quartet began their recessional. They walked up the aisle not just as husband and wife, but as something greater, a testament, a victory, a beginning. And much later, when the last glass of champagne had been raised, when rose petals had settled and stars blinked above them, they stood at the edge of their infinity pool. Behind them, the villa glowed like a lantern. Myra turned to him, touched his face with fingers that had memorized every scar. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when I was invisible." And when he kissed her, when he poured everything into that one quiet, holy touch, the sea carried their laughter out into the world, and the stars, ancient and eternal, burned just a little brighter, as if the universe itself understood. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of forever.